All told, 34 climbers departed for the summit in the middle of that night. Although we left the col as members of 3 distinct expeditions, our fates were already starting to intertwine, and they would become more and more tightly bound with every meter we ascended. The night had a cold, phantasmal beauty that intensified as we climbed. More stars than I had ever seen smeared the frozen sky. A gibbous moon rose above the shoulder of 27,824-foot Makalu, washing the slope beneath my boots in ghostly light, obviating the need for a headlamp. Far to the southeast, along the India-Nepal frontier, colossal thunderheads drifted over the malarial swamps of the Terai, illuminating the heavens with surreal bursts of orange and blue lightning. Within 3 hours of leaving the col, Frank decided that something about the day just didn't feel right. Stepping out of the queue, he turned around and descended to the tents. His 4th attempt to climb Everest was over. Not long after that, Doug stepped aside as well. He was a little ahead of me at the time, recalls Lou. All of a sudden he stepped out of line and just stood there. When I moved up beside him, he told me he was cold and feeling bad, and was heading down. Then Rob, who was bringing up the rear, caught up to Doug, and a brief conversation ensued. Nobody overheard the dialogue, so there is no way of knowing what was said, but the upshot was that Doug got back in line and continued his ascent. The day before departing base camp, Rob had sat the team down in the mess tent and given us a lecture about the importance of obeying his orders on summit day. "I will tolerate no dissension up there," he admonished, staring pointedly at me. "My word will be absolute law beyond appeal. If you don't like a particular decision I make, I'd be happy to discuss it with you afterward, but not while we're on the hill." The most obvious source of potential conflict was the likelihood that Rob might decide to turn us around before the summit. But there was another matter he was particularly concerned about. During the latter stages of the acclimatization period, he'd given us slightly freer rein to climb at our own pace, for instance. Hall sometimes allowed me to travel 2 hours or more out in front of the main group. He now stressed, however, that for the first half of the summit day, he wanted everybody to climb in close proximity. "Until we all reach the crest of the southeast ridge," he pronounced, referring to a distinctive promontory at 27,600 feet known as the balcony. "Everyone needs to stay within 100 meters of each other. This is very important. We will be climbing in the dark, and I want the guides to be able to keep close track of you." Ascending through the pre-dawn hours of May 10th, those of us at the head of the pack were thus compelled to repeatedly stop and wait in the bone-cracking cold for our slowest members to catch up. On one occasion, Mike Groom, Serdar Angdorje, and I sat on a snow-covered ledge for more than 45 minutes, shivering and pounding our hands and feet to ward off frostbite, waiting for the others to arrive. But the squandered time was even more excruciating to bear than the cold. At 3:45 a.m., Mike announced that we'd gotten too far ahead and needed to stop and wait yet again. Pressing my body against a shale outcrop, trying to escape the sub-zero breeze now blowing from the west, I stared down the precipitous slope and attempted to identify the climbers inching toward us in the moonlight. As they advanced, I could see that some members of Fisher's group had caught up with our group. Hall's team, the Mountain Madness team, and the Taiwanese were now jumbled into one long, intermittent queue. And then something peculiar caught my eye. 65 feet below, a tall figure in a bright yellow down jacket and pants was hitched to the back of a much smaller Sherpa by a 3-foot length of cord. The Sherpa, not wearing an oxygen mask, huffing loudly, was hauling his partner up the slope like a horse pulling a plow. The odd pair was passing other people and making good time. But the arrangement, a technique for assisting a weak or injured climber known as short roping, appeared to be hazardous and extremely uncomfortable for both parties. By and by, I recognized the Sherpa as flamboyant Serdar, Lopsang Jangbu, and the climber in yellow as Sandy Pittman. Guide Neil Beidelman, who also observed Lopsang towing Pittman, recalls, "As I came up from below, Lopsang was leaning into the slope, clinging to the rock like a spider, supporting Sandy on a tight tether. It looked awkward and quite dangerous. I wasn't sure what to make of it." Around 4:15 a.m., Mike gave us the go-ahead to resume our ascent, and Angdorje and I started climbing as fast as we could in order to warm ourselves. As the first hint of daybreak brightened the eastern horizon, the rocky terraced terrain we'd been ascending gave way to a broad gully of unconsolidated snow. Taking turns breaking trail through the calf-deep powder, Angdorje and I reached the crest of the southeast ridge at 5:30, just as the sun edged into the sky. Three of the world's 5 highest peaks stood out in craggy relief against the pastel dawn. My altimeter read 27,600 feet. Hall had made it very clear that I was to climb no higher until the whole group had gathered at this balcony-like roost, so I sat down on my pack to wait. When Rob and Beck finally arrived at the back of the herd, I'd been sitting for more than 90 minutes. As I waited, both Fisher's group and the Taiwanese team caught and passed me. I felt frustrated about wasting so much time and peeved at falling behind everybody else. But I understood Hall's rationale, so I kept a tight lid on my anger. During my 34-year tenure as a climber, I'd found that the most rewarding aspects of mountaineering derive from the sport's emphasis on self-reliance, on making critical decisions and dealing with the consequences, on personal responsibility. When you sign on as a client, I discovered, you are forced to give up all of that and more. For safety's sake, a responsible guide will always insist on calling the shots. He or she simply can't afford to let each client make important decisions independently. Passivity on the part of the clients had thus been encouraged throughout our expedition. Sherpas put in the route, set up the camps, did the cooking, hauled all the loads. This conserved our energy and vastly increased our chances of getting up Everest, but I found it hugely unsatisfying. I felt at times as if I wasn't really climbing the mountain, that surrogates were doing it for me. Although I had willingly accepted this role in order to climb Everest with Hall, I never got used to it. So I was happy as hell when, at 7:10 a.m., he arrived atop the balcony and gave me the okay to continue climbing.